The opening months of 1942 were a grueling ordeal for the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. Outgunned and outnumbered compared with the Pacific Fleet, and saddled with many aging surface vessels, it lacked the strength to challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy in any decisive surface action. Nevertheless, because its ships and bases were positioned in and around the Philippine archipelago under Admiral Thomas S. E. Hart, the fleet could at least impose delays and complicate Japan's planned southward advance, buying time, if not strategic victory, for Allied forces. The shock waves from the December attacks were immediate and crippling. Japanese bombing raids smashed the Cavite Navy Yard outside Manila, wrecking repair facilities, workshop stores, and many shore-based supplies, while much of the American land-based air component meant to shield the fleet was neutralized. With the principal operating base heavily damaged and Filipino defenders unable to stop the invasion, the hard choice was made to withdraw most of Hart's surface force to the Netherlands East Indies. That move placed Allied ships into a hasty multinational command, the ABDA Force, combining American, British, Dutch, and Australian warships. ABDA was cobbled together under extreme pressure and sent to contest Japanese movements, but it suffered crushing defeats in quick succession. The actions in the Flores Sea on February 4th, the Badong Strait on February 19-20, and the decisive clash in the Java Sea on February 27th, after which the strategic picture collapsed further. By March, Singapore, the linchpin of British naval power in the region, had fallen and Allied surface units were largely dispersed or destroyed, while American ground forces in the Philippines were hemmed into a shrinking defensive perimeter as Japanese armies advanced into the Netherlands East Indies. The sequence of setbacks exposed the limits of surface power in the theater and underscored how vital mobility, supply, and air cover were to naval operations. When those elements failed, ships could not sustain offensive action and were forced into a reactive, often desperate posture. Out of that grim context, the submarine force emerged as the Asiatic Fleet's most effective offensive instrument. Composed of a mix of modern fleet submarines and older coastal types, the force numbered 29 at the outbreak and benefited from recent intensive training that left crews as prepared as circumstances allowed. After the fall of the Philippines, the submariners faced severe logistical hardship. Repair facilities, spare parts and supply depots destroyed at Cavite meant boats had to rely on ad hoc support, with submarine tenders functioning as mobile repair and supply bases that shifted between anchorages to keep boats at sea. Early mission priorities were straightforward but dangerous. Interdict Japanese invasion convoys moving through the Philippine and Dutch East Indies waters, cover Allied withdrawals, and if possible harass Japanese shipping to slow their operational tempo. These patrols took a toll. A number of submarines, including Shark and Perch, were lost to enemy action in the first 4 months. S-36 ran aground and was scuttled. And despite limited resources, American subs were credited with sinking several Japanese ships during this period. Life aboard was austere and tense. Long hours at periscope depth, maintenance improvised under the shadow of air patrols, and the constant knowledge that enemy anti-submarine measures were improving day by day. Lieutenant Commander Fred W. Weir and his boat Seawolf, SS-197, typified the campaign's intensity. Commissioned in December 1939 and later assigned to the Asiatic Fleet, Seawolf was the last of the Sargo class, a roughly toothy 350-ton vessel about 311 feet long, capable of roughly 20 knots on the surface and under 9 knots submerged, with a crew of around 55 and an armament that included 24 torpedoes and both forward and aft tubes. After service in the Atlantic and Caribbean, she joined the Pacific Fleet and was based in Manila. When war erupted, she slipped out of the harbor amid chaos, and while her early patrols off the northeastern Philippines and en route to Australia produced few contacts, her missions combined combat patrols with vital supply and evacuation runs, such as carrying 50 caliber ammunition to Corregidor, unloading under the threat of enemy action, taking on passengers and torpedoes, and then steaming toward Java to continue operations. Encounters with Japanese convoys and patrol craft, often impeded by foul weather or vigilant escorts, highlighted both the opportunity and the peril faced by American submariners. They could strike where surface forces could not. Yet they operated with scant support and under ever-increasing danger as Japanese anti-submarine tactics sharpened. The submarine had been steered clear of the nearby minefields by early evening, and by 1700 hours was making a lone northerly run at about 17 knots on her fourth war patrol, a mission that would keep her largely in the contested seas around Java, where American undersea forces were again charged with trying to interdict Japanese landing operations. Much of the patrol involved slow cat-and-mouse work, running submerged during daylight to avoid air patrols, coming up at night to recharge batteries, plotting likely convoy routes from sparse intelligence and local currents, and constantly adjusting depth and course to evade escorts. On 19th of February, Seawolf sighted enemy ships off the coast of Bali, east of Java, and fired torpedoes at 2 troop transports after maneuvering into attack position. The spread failed to score, and the boat immediately endured a severe depth-charge counterattack that hammered the hull and tested both the crew's nerves and their ship's structural resilience. A few days later, on 25th of February in the Badung Strait, Seawolf again engaged enemy units, firing at a destroyer and a transport. The commander believed he had struck the transport and possibly the destroyer when explosions were reported by the sonar operator, and he readied the boat for the depth-charge salvo that usually followed such hits. Post-war Japanese records, however, indicate no vessels were lost in that clash, so despite Ware's tactical skill and the crew's determination, the action produced no confirmed sinkings. It did, nonetheless, force the enemy to deploy escorts more aggressively and underscored the difficulty of scoring decisive results against well-escorted convoys in narrow straits. The broader campaign in late February and early March made clear that submarines, while useful, could not by themselves stop the Japanese advance. Allied surface forces were almost annihilated in the Battle of the Java Sea, and the subsequent landings proceeded with little effective maritime resistance. With surface units routed, roughly a dozen American submarines remained in the area to wage a campaign of harassment against Japanese merchant and escort traffic, striking where they could to slow supply lines and force the enemy to divert resources to protection. Seawolf and Pike, SS-173, were assigned a patrol area south of Java with instructions to search for any large enemy carriers or striking forces that might be operating in support of the invasion. None were found. A reminder that Japanese strategy in the region relied heavily on the mobility of their surface and air assets. The patrols stretched crews to the limit. Extended periods at periscope depth and long nights without full surfacing left men sleep-deprived and edgy. Maintenance had to be improvised when spare parts were scarce, and small comforts ran out, cigarettes being a notable casualty of supply shortages that led some sailors to resort to smoking roasted coffee grounds wrapped in toilet paper. Despite those hardships, the boat still had to return to combat, and in mid-March, Imperial General Headquarters ordered the seizure of Christmas Island, a tiny British-administered atoll in the eastern Indian Ocean more than 200 miles south of Java's western extremity, whose phosphate deposits were of strategic value to Japan's war economy. In late March, a Japanese task group steamed from Bantam Bay to occupy the isle. The force included 3 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, an oiler, and 2 transports carrying approximately 850 troops under Rear Admiral Shojin Nishimura, with the light cruiser Naka serving as the on-scene command ship. While operating near the Sunda Strait off Java's west end, Seawolf observed and reported the convoy on 27 March, sending a coded contact message that led to fresh orders that night for where to make for Christmas Island, and then proceed to Australia under diesel power while surfacing at night to recharge batteries. The submarine increased speed to roughly 14 knots and traveled on a southerly bearing, alternating periscope depth running by day with night surfacing. During daylight, the commander reviewed navigation charts and sketched potential approaches the Japanese might use to encircle or defend the island, seeking probable choke points and sheltered coves that would make suitable landing sites. By evening, Seawolf had covered nearly 190 miles and lookouts spotted Christmas Island, about 25 miles off the starboard bow. Around midnight, the Japanese convoy and Seawolf were, unknown to each other, converging on intersecting tracks that would bring them into close proximity in the small hours of 29th March. Approaching with extreme caution, Weir logged that he stood off about 8 miles to starboard of the island and used the low, broken moonlight to make a careful reconnaissance to ascertain whether the island remained under friendly control and to identify any likely disembarkation points. At about 06:18, he brought the periscope up near the northwest tip by Flying Fish Cove and observed what appeared to be a partially submerged merchantman with a yellow funnel and a gray hull. His estimate put it near 8,000 tons, anchored but with no visible activity at the pier or in the settlement. Deeming the anchorage quiet, Seawolf fell back and swept toward the island's southern shores to continue the survey. On 30th March, a large seaplane circled the northerly approach at roughly 1,500 feet. Whether it was a reconnaissance element of the convoy or an independent patrol remained uncertain, but it passed over the submerged boat without detecting it. Later that evening, Weir surfaced after a day of cautious reconnaissance and concluded that Flying Fish Cove was effectively the only practicable landing site for an occupation. Other stretches of coastline were blocked by shallow reefs and offshore rocks that would make landing operations hazardous. So his report would have strategic importance in alerting both the Japanese planners and any remaining Allied defenders to the terrain's constraints. Because the shoreline was steep, wooded and ringed with cliffs with heavy surf and only a few usable landing spots, the skipper elected to hold station along an 11-mile arc roughly 6 to 7 miles off the mouth of Flying Fish Cove. Occasional brief rain squalls moved through, but moonlight often lit the night, improving visibility for lookouts and, in Weir's view, creating favorable conditions for intercepting any Japanese vessels approaching the isle. Seawolf, still riding after an overnight battery charge, settled in just after 0600 on 31st of March, when the sonar operator reported contact pings off the port bow. As Weir ordered the boat to submerge, a searchlight suddenly swept from the starboard beam, and the sound of an approaching ship's screws came from about 3,000 yards. Weir drove the submarine down to about 200 feet and executed evasive turns. 2 depth charges struck during the initial plunge, and a heavy pattern of roughly 10 more detonated a few minutes later, shaking the boat and testing the crew's resolve. But the barrage lasted only about half an hour. Near 0700, Weir raised Seawolf to periscope depth and peered out to find the ocean crowded with enemy units. A veritable target-rich environment he quickly sketched and logged. A light cruiser about 7,000 yards ahead, 2 transports roughly 8,000 yards to port, a destroyer some 6,000 yards away, and another light cruiser to starboard. Moving swiftly to record bearings and silhouettes, Weir identified 3 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 2 transports. Using his recognition manual, he named 2 cruisers as Tory type and the other as a Jinsu class. Evidence the invasion was in full swing and that Japanese forces were conducting organized amphibious operations. He decided to engage the portside cruiser first, later, noting that the transports lay too far to the west to be caught, then altered course in hopes of intercepting one of the merchantmen, but concluded with disappointment. Looks like we can't get him. Close observation revealed the cruiser's seaplane catapults empty, the aircraft presumably engaged in supporting the assault ashore, and Weir singled out the Jinsu-class ship's pronounced clipper bow and an ornamental figurehead resembling a flaming sun or chrysanthemum. Frequent signal flashes suggested this vessel was the on-scene flagship and, as were surmised, Admiral Nishimura's Naka. Seawolf eased nearer to the cove's entrance while multiple Japanese units pinged the area without locating her. A slight chop with occasional whitecaps helped conceal the periscope. 2 seaplanes circled overhead and 2 distant detonations were heard just before 0800. To gain a better approach, Weir briefly took the boat down to about 120 feet and then returned to periscope depth. For the next hour, he carefully trailed Naka, maneuvering when the cruiser's course opened a firing window. At nearly 0900, when the target presented the required parameters, Seawolf reduced speed. The skipper estimated range at roughly 1,400 yards, and the target's speed at about 15 knots, and ordered the outer torpedo doors opened. Henry Binglin, the torpedo officer, verified the tubes were ready, and at 8:48, a rapid salvo of 4 bow torpedoes ran out in a sequence lasting 1 minute, set to run at about 10 feet depth, and aimed at the enemy cruiser's predicted track and ends of the hull. Weir took one final look through the scope before the boat slipped beneath the surface and later recalled the faint smoke of torpedo wakes and the charged movement of men responding to the launch. What followed next would test both the crew's nerves and the limits of undersea strike. Tactics against a well-protected invasion group. Shouts rose from the cruiser's quarterdeck as the range closed to roughly 700 yards. Seawolf slammed to top speed, swung hard to starboard, and dove to about 120 feet. Leaving the crew to wait anxiously for news of the strike and to brace for counterattack, Weir later said the interval felt like an eternity. Soon the commanding officer heard an explosion. Some men thought they heard too, and the sound of the cruiser's screws ceased, which to those on board suggested a hit. The crew believed they had struck a valuable target, but post-war records show no Japanese losses from that action, implying the torpedoes likely malfunctioned or detonated prematurely. Minutes later, Weir ordered the boat down to 200 feet as a series of depth charges, initially 8, began to fall. The hatch above was battened as he climbed into the control room, and the crew struggled to open a flood valve against sea pressure, finally forcing it by hand only to blow a gasket. A fast ship came on the starboard beam. Sonar registered several faint explosions, then 5 distant charges and 7 that hit much closer astern. A prolonged cat-and-mouse pursuit followed for many hours, with Weir grumbling about the pumps. "Every time a pump runs, they come in on us," and noting that air binding and high discharge pressures made a terrible roar. Seawolf trembled with each blast. Paint and cork insulation flew through the stale air, lights dimmed at times, and Chief Radioman Joseph Eberg feared a direct hit as the barrage mounted to about 25 depth charges. Though she survived, the pounding produced serious mechanical problems. An engine lube oil cooler failed. Overboard circulation leaks let salt water creep into the engine sump. 2 gyro repeaters went out. The radio set acted erratically. Valve wheels spun wildly in the engine room, and cabling in the conning tower plus 1 stern torpedo tube began to leak. The men hauled buckets of seawater into sanitary tanks to protect electrical gear and fought to keep systems functioning. Slipping away to the northwest, Seawolf seemed to have shaken her pursuers by mid-afternoon. But Weir remained cautious, alternating deep runs with brief periscope checks. Shortly after 1700, a sweep showed no Japanese units to the west of Christmas Island, while rain and a squall or haze loomed over Flying Fish Cove. At 1949, the boat surfaced to charge batteries. The deck shelter light was extinguished and left off for the remainder of the trip, and broken bells, probably loosened by the depth charging, were noted. Uncertain whether enemy forces remained in the area, Weir radioed a contact report and ordered an eastward course to pass north of the island so he could approach the northeast point under the moon's shadow and dive behind it around Oro 600 for reconnaissance, aiming to be 10 miles east of Christmas by 0500. Later that night, a lookout reported 2 apparent torpedo wakes on the starboard beam, prompting a crash dive, but sonar picked up no further sounds, and the wakes were likely flotsam carried northwest by tide and current. About 30 minutes before midnight, headquarters sent a congratulatory radio message with a handwritten note praising the crew's efforts. Weir said they were feeling pretty well beaten down, so they posted the commendation on the ship's bulletin board and wished the sender could have been with them on the next patrol. Shortly after the skipper fell asleep, the officer of the deck called a contact about 10 miles off the island's northern coast. Through a large glass, he identified an Asashio-class destroyer, and lookouts held it under observation as Seawolf slowed and altered course. Weir revised his plan when he sighted a light cruiser. An intended afternoon attack by steaming 20 miles. East was shelved because torpedo stocks were low. 1 forward torpedo had been removed from its tube due to an air leak losing, roughly 500 pounds a day, leaving only about 5. Torpedoes believed serviceable, which meant any remaining shots had to count. In the small hours, Seawolf caught the silhouette of a light cruiser slowly circling. After about 30 minutes, it turned and steamed directly at the submarine at roughly 11 knots from an initial range near 6,000 yards. Were maneuvered for a stern shot and, after careful observation, judged the target to be a Notori or Nagara-class light cruiser. He worked more than half an hour to perfect his firing solution. When the ship closed to about 1,700 yards, 3 stern torpedoes were fired in a spread set to run about 10 feet deep, and within a minute a tremendous explosion rocked the submarine. At periscope depth, were strained to judge the result, but clouded moonlight limited visibility. He saw no flames or searchlight use, though a thick column of black smoke was visible, and the cruiser appeared to slow, suggesting Seawolf had at least disrupted or damaged an enemy unit and thus added to the cost of the Japanese occupation effort. The crew heard cheering from the cruiser's quarterdeck as the range closed to about 700 yards. Seawolf accelerated to maximum speed, swung sharply to starboard, and dove to roughly 120 feet, leaving the men to wait tensely for news of the strike and to brace for retaliation. Ware later said the pause felt interminable. Soon an explosion was audible. Some believed there were 2, and the noise of the cruiser's screws fell silent, which led those aboard to think they had scored a hit. Post-war evidence, however, shows no confirmed Japanese losses from that moment, suggesting torpedoes may have malfunctioned or detonated prematurely. Minutes later, Ware ordered the boat down to 200 feet as a pattern of depth charges. First a few, then a heavier series, began to fall. As he moved from the conning tower into the control room, the crew wrestled with a flood valve that would not open against the sea pressure. They finally forced it by hand, but in doing so blew a gasket. A fast ship closed on the starboard beam. Sonar picked up distant small explosions. Then a sequence of charges grew ever nearer. For many hours, a grim cat-and-mouse chase followed, with Ware grumbling about pumps running and drawing attention. Every time a pump runs, they come in on us, while the boat shuddered under each blast. Paint and cork insulation rained through the stale air, and lights dimmed intermittently. Chief radioman Joseph Aberg feared a direct hit as the enemy's barrage built to some 25 depth-charge detonations. Seawolf survived but suffered damage. An engine lube oil cooler failed. Leaks in the overboard circulation allowed salt water into the engine sump. 2 gyro repeaters went out. The radio acted erratically. Valve wheels spun in the engine room, and wiring in the conning tower plus a stern torpedo tube began to leak. Sailors hauled seawater into sanitary tanks to safeguard electrical gear and fought to keep the boat operational. Slipping away to the northwest, Seawolf seemed to shake off her pursuers by mid-afternoon, though Ware stayed cautious, alternating deep runs with occasional periscope checks. By late afternoon, rain and a squall or haze had settled over Flying Fish Cove and the sea off Christmas Island. The submarine surfaced at 1949 to charge batteries, but kept the deck shelter light off for the rest of the voyage. Broken bells were also noted, likely loosened by the depth charging. Unsure whether enemy forces remained, Ware sent a contact report and set a course east to pass north of the island so he could approach the northeast point under moon shadow and reconnoiter by dawn. Later that night, lookouts reported 2 apparent torpedo wakes on the starboard beam, and Seawolf made a crash dive, though sonar found no further sounds, and the wakes were likely debris carried by tide and current. About 30 minutes before midnight, headquarters sent a congratulatory message and a handwritten note praising the crew's efforts. Weir said they were feeling pretty well beaten down, so they pinned the commendation to the ship's bulletin board. After the skipper slept, the officer of the deck called a contact some 10 miles off the island's northern coast, and using a large glass, identified an Asashio-class destroyer. As Seawolf slowed and altered course, the captain sighted a light cruiser and revised his plan, an intended afternoon attack by steaming 20 miles. East was abandoned because torpedo stocks were low. 1. Forward torpedo had been withdrawn from its tube because an air leak was losing about 500 pounds a day, leaving only a handful of serviceable weapons. So every remaining shot had to count. In the small hours, Seawolf observed a light cruiser slowly circling. After about 30 minutes, it turned and steamed directly at the submarine at roughly 11 knots from a range near 6,000 yards. Were maneuvered for a stern shot and after careful observation judged the target to be a Notori or Nagara-class light cruiser. He spent more than half an hour perfecting his firing solution. When the ship closed to about 1,700 yards, 3 stern torpedoes were fired in a spread at roughly 10 feet depth, and within a minute, a tremendous explosion rocked the submarine. At periscope depth, we're strained to see the result, but moonlight and cloud made observation difficult. He reported no visible flames or searchlight use, but did note a thick column of black smoke and that the cruiser appeared to slow, suggesting Seawolf had at least struck or seriously disrupted an enemy vessel and thereby hindered the invasion effort. The Japanese did not let the attack go unanswered. As night fell, they began depth charging with intensity. They gave us hell until near midnight. We're recalled, and the submarine's 7 enclosed compartments became hot, humid, and foul with stale air. With the ship's air conditioning shut down to reduce noise, men lay on their bunks trying to endure. Salt tablets were issued by the chief pharmacist's mate but offered little relief. After an hour's lull, Ware ordered periscope depth at about 1,900 hours, thinking the danger had passed. But during the ascent, a trim tank misaligned and the boat broached suddenly, the top of the conning tower breaking the surface in a geyser of water that instantly alerted the enemy. Were ordered an emergency dive and the boat plunged as depth charges began to fall directly overhead. The first detonations came too close for comfort, and Seawolf dove to 200 feet, while the remaining charges pummeled the area. Batteries were running dangerously low, and the crew stopped non-essential equipment, leaving only an emergency motor generator and a gyro to conserve power. Conversation was whispered, and the men feared they might never surface if they could not recharge. By late evening, it seemed most of the Japanese force had departed, leaving a single destroyer to harass the sub. That ship would occasionally fire 1 to 4 depth charges from a Y-gun while moving slowly. Slipping away at minimal speed and with almost no power for sprinting, Seawolf nevertheless escaped, and Ware later said their survival owed to luck rather than any brilliant seamanship. Not long after 2200, the submarine rose to periscope depth and still heard intermittent pings off the starboard quarter, but found no ships on survey. With the crew exhausted and torpedo stocks depleted, Ware set course for Fremantle, Australia. Seawolf surfaced around Iro 30 and ran west, stopping intermittently to recharge batteries. The fight over Christmas Island on shore met no organized resistance. The small garrison, largely Indian troops, surrendered quickly, and on 4 April 1942, a U.S. Navy communique credited an American submarine with sinking a Japanese light cruiser near the island and probably damaging another. The flagship Naka was badly damaged by a torpedo strike and was towed back to Java and on to Singapore for temporary repairs before returning to Japan for more complete work. She later rejoined operations in 1943, but was ultimately sunk by American carrier aircraft near Truk in February 1944. And Admiral Nishimura, who survived the raid, later lost his life in battle. It was not for lack of daring or effort that Fred Ware and his crew failed to secure a larger tally off Christmas Island, torpedo unreliability, and the hazards of attacking well-escorted invasion forces limited their success. Were completed 7 war patrols in Seawolf before receiving another command. He acquired a reputation as a bold and skilled submariner and in time rose to flag rank. Seawolf herself completed 14 war patrols, being credited with numerous sinkings and damage to enemy shipping, but on 21 September 1944 she departed from Brisbane for her 15th patrol under a new commanding officer, stopped briefly to take on supplies and army passengers, and after exchanging signals with the submarine Narwhal on 3 October was lost. It is likely that American destroyer escorts and aircraft searching for a Japanese submarine in the area mistakenly sank Seawolf near Morotai Island. All 79 aboard, including the 17 Army passengers, were lost. Seawolf rests on eternal patrol, and the Navy's Silent Service Memorial and History continue to honor the courage of her crew and the more than 3,300 submariners